Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful Yorkshire moor scene from a photograph that I found on Pixabay. I shall include the link in the description below and all the details of the materials that I've used. This is a piece of quarter imperial sized Milford cold pressed paper, 140 pounds weight. It's taped to my board and my board is at an angle of about 45 degrees. I'm using a Kohinoor 6B sketching pencil. It's like a carpenter's pencil to sketch out a very simplified version of the photograph. I'm just including the shape of the horizon at the top of the Moorland hill and those beautiful trees and a little bit of land in the far distance. For the trees, I'm going to reduce them down to two main trees. There are some smaller ones in the photograph that I won't bother with. I just want to focus on these trees as the focal point. So I'm going to roughly sketch them in to make sure I've got a guide as to how large I want them to be so that they're balanced with the rest of the painting. So I'm just looking for the rough basic shapes of the main branches here. I want these branches to continue further over towards the right, like they do in the photograph. I'm hoping that will give me a windswept look, because the Yorkshire moors are wild and rugged, and so I want to try and capture a little bit of that atmosphere in the painting. I think that's okay for the tree, so now I'm going to roughly mark out the darker areas and the sort of shape of the bushes that are growing on this moorland hill. Just very loosely, just marking out the rough shapes so that I can have a loose guide when I come to paint. Now that'll be fine. So I will start off painting my sky. I'm going to paint straight onto the dry paper, so I'm mixing up 3 puddles of nice diluted, very watery paint. It's still well pigmented. I've got raw sienna, burnt umber and cobalt blue. Those are the 3 colours that I'm going to use for my sky. I want plenty of them so that I can paint freely without having to mix up more. I'm using a squirrel mop brush. I'm loading it full of paint. Squirrel mops hold lots of paint and lots of water, so that's why they're one of the best types of brushes for this sort of sky. And I'm starting off with raw sienna, spreading it across the middle of the sky, making sure I apply plenty of paint and that it's very watery so that none of those edges dry out. Put a bit of that across the hill where it's brightest as well, underneath the tree. Now I'm going to go in with my cobalt blue. I don't really want a very blue sky for this, but I'm using the cobalt blue because as soon as it blends with the raw sienna and then the burnt umber that I'm going to put in later, I should get sort of bluish grey, various different tones and shades. So it should make my sky a bit more interesting. I'm dipping into a bit more water here and there to dilute the paint so that it's not all at the same sort of flat tone. This is my burnt umber. You can see that it's blending well with the other 2 colours to give me that sort of greyed out look. I've got browns, I've got greys, blues, yellows, the white of the paper. There's all sorts going on in the sky. That's nearly there. The last thing I want to do is overwork it, so I'm trying to finish it nice and quickly before any of the paint starts drying. Gravity has caused a bead of water and paint to arrive at the edge there, so I've just mopped that up with a clean damp brush. I'm going to continue now with the underpainting and paint the land. This is raw sienna, a slightly richer mix, but still very dilute, very watery, a little bit more pigment this time. And I'm looking at my photograph and I'm going to run this paint quickly across the landscape, just coating all the areas that look kind of sort of yellowish and the palest on the moor. So I'm building up an underpainting for the land at this stage using the same three colours. So I'm mixing up a bit more of my burnt umber, and I'm now going to push some of that burnt umber in between the raw sienna and in the areas where I've got some quite dark bushes on my bank. My brush strokes are quite large and scribbly because I'm trying just to get a nice even coating. I'm creating a wet in wet environment, and all these colours are blending beautifully together, diffusing softly, and should give me a nice underpainting. I'm just smoothing out the horizon over that little bit of distant land and putting a bit of very pale cobalt blue in there as an underpainting for the sort of look of recession and distance for that little piece of land that you can see beyond the moor. I'm now adding cobalt blue. This should just give me a bit of an extra sort of zing to the land. It will also mix with those colours and give me some nice greys, but I think it'll also give me the look of reflected light in the underpainting from the sky. It will also blend with the other colours, and I should get, as I said, some nice greys and browns and all sorts of different tones, which will be a lovely base to paint on my final details. This is the burnt umber that's now going in. And you can see that it's bringing the blue down to a nice sort of gentle, soft, almost heathery sort of shadow colour. I'm adding more paint to the raw sienna puddle, so there's more pigment, less water. I'm dabbing out the surplus water onto a tissue and now putting the richer paint around the focal point of those two trees on the ground. Everything's still wet, so it should all diffuse really nicely, but this should just give me that slightly brighter underpainting, which should draw the eye towards the tree. Just running that through the rest of the painting, and then I'll just darken up a little bit more as well. The underpainting is nearly finished. I'm just going to dot in a few more darks while everything's still wet, because I can get those nice diffusions and slightly smaller marks that will diffuse a little bit less as the paper begins to dry. I'm just able to keep those marks slightly sharper and very slightly darker, so I can begin to introduce some texture this way before it all dries. And just before I do leave it to dry, I'm going to use the corner of a plastic store card. You could use a palette knife or a pen knife. And I'm going to pull it through the paint, the sharp piece through the paint, and it's giving me some lovely textural marks for grasses and plants and flowers and things like that growing up on the moorland bank. I think for a loose painting, this effect just starts it off really nicely. It can get all the textures going a little bit more. Now I'm going to leave it to dry completely. It's nice and dry now. It's dried back nicely. The sky is very soft and light, just how I wanted it. So now it's time for me to mix up a nice, thickly pigmented but fairly inky consistency Payne's grey for these focal point trees. And I'm going to use my number 2 rigger, or it might be a number 3, I can't remember, and paint in over the top of my pencil lines the main branches for these trees. This is one of the reasons why it's a good idea to get the sketch of your tree right before you start painting, because then it makes painting the trees in much easier. This is a shortened version of a tutorial that's over on Patreon in 3 parts where I show every brush stroke. There are also reference photographs for you to refer to and download for the line drawing and the original Pixabay photograph, as well as the finished painting. So if you're interested in that, please follow the link to Patreon below. I'm now blocking in the trunk of the larger tree, making it thicker and making sure that it's quite bent and distorted by the wind of the Yorkshire moors. I'm overlapping the trees and that kind of knits them both together visually. It makes them both look sort of more convincing and more realistic if you can overlap them a little bit like that. So all the main branches are in for now, and I'm moving on to a bit more work on the foreground. This is a mixture of cobalt blue, raw sienna, with a little bit of cadmium yellow to brighten it up, and I'm running this through between the other colours using the same diagonal brush strokes to try and begin to build up some texture and tone in the moorland landscape. Focusing on where it's a little bit darker, I'm leaving quite a lot of the underpainting showing through. Following the undulations of the land and where the main bushes are. Adding a bit more paint in certain areas, the same colour, but a thicker application will give a slightly darker effect. A little bit of loose dry brush work on that edge keeps the horizon line, the top of the hill, sort of soft, with soft and hard edges. I've softened off some of those edges with a clean damp brush, and now I'm going into my favourite dark green, which is Winsor & Newton perylene green. I've mixed a very rich mixture of it, and I'm using my small harky brush, the tips and the corner, to work my darks into that paler colour. That mixture that I just put on, it's still wet, so the perylene green is softening and diffusing, but because it's thicker than the paint that I just put on, it's staying in place, it's not diffusing out completely. And the idea here is to get some really nice dark shadows and to block out the areas here, but with nice texture for where the most of the dark bushes are. Again, I need to leave plenty of the underpainting showing through. It's the variety of tones, colours and textures that should bring this loose painting to life. If you don't have perylene green, then you can mix up a nice dark green with something like ultramarine blue or cobalt blue with cadmium yellow, and maybe darken it up in parts with some Payne's grey. And the corner of a plastic store card, again, here and there, not too much, just a few places to bring some grass textures through that rich paint. The next thing I'm going to do is to add a little bit more colour to the little bit of distant land across here on the left side. At the moment it looks like water. I'm just going to add some pale, quite watery grey across that area, and soften some of it back using just horizontal lines, and I'm hoping that will look like distant moorland going off in the distance behind that hill. Making sure my horizon line is nice and straight there. It's all just about dried off again now, and so I'm going to go in with a smaller rigger. I think this is a size 1, and I'm going to add lots and lots of little tiny twiggy branches to the very ends of these main branches that I painted earlier. Going to add these little twigs, lots of them, to nearly all the ends of the main branches here, just to add that finishing touch. So that's nearly all the branches in and all the little twigs. Maybe just bring a few more out, a bit more over this side, using this Payne's grey mixture and my fine rigger. Maybe a few thicker areas of twigs running behind that main tree. I'm back to my larger rigger, size 2 or 3 this one. It's a Dale Rowney graduate rigger, and I'm going to put in some Payne's grey heavier grasses amongst the lighter grasses that I scraped out with the corner of the card earlier. Maybe dot and dash in a few flowers here and there. So at this point, if you wanted to, you could use some cadmium yellow for some gorse flowers, but I don't think I'm going to. I think I'm quite happy with the sort of muted, limited palette the way it is at the moment. And now back in with a bit more perylene green underneath those grassy outcrops and anywhere else that needs just a little bit of darkening up. And a final finishing touch, some very dry, almost straight from the tube, perylene green on a dry brush, and just some dry brush marks here and there to add even more variety and texture to that moorland ground. And here's the finished painting. With the tape removed, you can see the nice clean white border, and you can see how it really improves the look of the painting. I'm really happy with the textures, the tones and the colours. I like the bits of blue in the moorland landscape that kind of reflect the light from the sky. And I'm very happy with the shape of the trees. I hope you'll give it a go. It's a nice, easy landscape, nice and simple for beginners to try. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.